My name is Brian Pennix, and I'm speaking to you from my home office in Northern California. I'm a Christian Science practitioner. That means I pray alongside individuals who are looking for healing. This prayer tracks the teachings of Christ Jesus about how it is that God actually takes care of us. For a number of years, I was a lawyer. I don't know, maybe it started in the law practice, maybe it came before that. But the notion of innocence as a lasting characteristic of how God makes us has always appealed to me. I was raised in church, but my early personal history kind of drifted all over the map. Over the years, though, I never forgot this church-inspired idea of a God-given innocence that never gets taken away from us. You know, innocence, it may seem like a simple thing, but it can also seem not so simple. And I say not so simple because, well, if you were to look up the word innocence on the internet, you know, Google the word, all sorts of visual images would pop up on your computer screen. Some are probably what you'd expect. Babies and bunnies and sweetness and joy. But a little surprisingly, also mixed in there can be some twisted and disturbing pictures of victimization, condemnation, kind of the opposite of innocence. One of the nicer images I remember seeing when I did this was an artist's rendering of Jesus. And if I remember correctly, he was leaning over a little bit, standing and leaning over a little bit. And you know, with the most affectionate eyes, deeply valuing a man who was disabled. This affectionate seeing points to what we'll be talking about today. It's not babies and bunnies so much, although fair warning, babies will come up. But we're going to look more at some of those other things that can seem mixed into our lives, saying that innocence is, well, gone, or who cares? It's not that important. Or maybe it's worse, maybe it's even dangerous. But you know, right in the middle of all that, we can begin to see or discover a Christ-like innocence that's always within us and that actually has a powerful healing impact. I'll offer some examples showing how this innocence that actually makes a difference isn't just for some folks, but you know, it's a present help for anyone. Here's one of those examples. Years ago, I was a freshman in a community college here in Northern California. I wasn't at all happy to be there. I had been accepted to a fine university, but couldn't attend because, well, our family just didn't have enough money. Now, I should just say that there's nothing wrong with a community college. And in fact, to tell you the truth, this one did me a lot of good. But at the time, I was feeling unfairly deprived of something I thought I deserved. And you know, that wasn't my only complaint, not by a long shot. Lots of things had been going wrong. There were ongoing effects from childhood physical neglect and abuse. And frankly, for this, I was carrying around a whole load of resentment. Then my dear girlfriend suddenly broke up with me. Heartbroken. I missed her terribly. But you know, I also began to wonder, what is wrong with me that so many things seem to be going so badly? Well, around this time, I had been doing some long distance running as a form of exercise. And at home one afternoon, after one of those long runs, I suddenly felt odd sensations in my hands and arms, and then a kind of numbness coupled with a feeling of pressure in my chest and upper abdomen. These things frightened me. One of the required courses in that community college was a health course. And I recalled a sobering lecture about heart attacks. I recognized some of the symptoms the health instructor had described. A family member at this moment telephoned a Christian Science practitioner and asked her to pray for me. As I said earlier, a Christian Science practitioner is a person who prays for healing along this Bible-based, Christ-like seeing or viewpoint we're talking about today. I'd already experienced some healing through prayer and Christian Science, and that's why this call was made. I'll talk more about how that prayer works as we go along, but for the moment, what mattered was that the practitioner started praying for me. I don't mind telling you, at that moment, I was really scared. In fact, I remember calling out, "We should call for an ambulance." And then, almost immediately, a deep calm swept over me. You know, I still remember that precise moment. It was as if this, I don't want to sound spooky, this warm, glowing atmosphere of love and peace just filled the room. I felt nothing but comforting love. This love seemed directed right at me. But interestingly, it also seemed to spread out from within me out toward everyone I knew. This love, it washed away the fear. It washed away the resentment. It washed away the heartbreak. And all those things just disappeared. It was almost as if they had never really been part of me in the first place. That moment, I felt I could safely love anyone. I'm going to say that again. I felt I could safely love anyone. The symptoms disappeared and I felt normal. In that moment, if you will, in that holy moment, I turned to the family member I so resented, and I said simply, "I love you." I can't honestly say our whole relationship was transformed right then. But at that moment, I felt a genuine love born out of this new conviction that I could safely love anyone. As to my lost girlfriend, well, she stayed lost. But you know, from that point on, I began to think more in terms of the kindly, more helpful things I could do for others, rather than dwell so much on what she might have thought was wrong with me. 2 years later, I did go on to that university, and afterwards I served in the Army, and there they determined my heart functioned normally, and there's never been a return of those symptoms. Thinking back, and I must say, thinking back gratefully, that event gave me a new firsthand sense, a close-up sense that there is a God of love, called love, who's actually knowable and not way off in the distance, but really right here with us all the time. I felt God's love was mine without having to be earned. It was unconditional. It came to me, it seemed to come to me no matter what I did. So maybe in a single word, I felt innocent, innocent of all those negative things that defined my life about that time, including the way my body was functioning in that acute moment. You know, in the broadest sense, this is what I've seen Christian Science do in my life and in the lives of others. The way Christian Science and the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, and incidentally, she's the one that founded this approach to Christianity. The way they explain these things is the basis of everything we'll be talking about today. You know, to some folks, God is a good and intelligent power or being that takes care of us and protects us from harm. But I know to others, God may seem capable of both good and bad, maybe even the source of calamities. You may have heard folks speak of natural disasters as what? As acts of God. And then there are those who just insist there is no God at all. Well, to get a better hold on the love that made me feel so innocent and healed, and then to base that love in a clearer sense of God, let's think a little bit about who God is. You know, for a lot of folks, the Bible is a doorway to learning more about God. But I know that for some others, the Bible some may feel it's suspect or unconvincing. There's little doubt, though, that in the past and nowadays, large numbers of people turn to the Bible for inspiration and comfort. You know, I don't know about you, but I see this fairly often, even in public places like coffee shops. Let me invite you to consider the inspiring story of a man named John Newton. He lived in the 1700s. He had been a profane, slave-trading ship captain who changed his ways when he felt that God had saved him from a violent storm at sea. You know, he believed his being saved was God's message right to him of his true inner worth. He began to study the Bible. Eventually, he was even ordained in the Church of England. And it was there that he wrote down some wonderful words to commemorate his feeling of salvation and forgiveness for the horrible wrongs of his past. We all now know those words as the lyrics to one of the most moving Christian hymns ever written, Amazing Grace. You know, my own experience showed me that, as it says in the Bible, God is powerful love itself. The Bible also describes God as truth itself. It describes God as the all-knowing Father. It even refers to God as a mothering love. Another clue to God's nature is found in the Bible's first story, in the book of Genesis, where it says, God creates us in God's own image. You know, if you think about that, this means we actually bear the characteristics of God. Now, to some, that may seem very surprising, but let me explain. It's not that any of us is God, not at all, but rather we're made by God to show forth godly qualities, qualities like wisdom, kindness, courage, innocence, and power to help ourselves and others. But I know not everyone sees things this way. In fact, some of us right now may be thinking of ourselves as, well, not so much made in God's image but rather physical, vulnerable to diseases or injustice, likely, well, maybe even pre-programmed to do the wrong thing much of the time. If we're honest, won't we admit we're all at least tempted to see ourselves or others this way? If we think of God at all, we might reverse the more inspiring views of God and how he made us, and instead think of God as having negative human traits, like changeableness, temper, a willingness to allow, maybe even to cause suffering. This reversed viewpoint of God, it's as old as human history. But the Bible also says of God that he is of purer eyes than to even see evil. I think that leads us back to innocence, to a more solid concept of innocence. So what is innocence? I'd guess anyone who's plagued with self-condemnation or who feels the accusations of others would love to feel just simply innocent. To others, though, innocence might seem, irrelevant. Or, as I suggested earlier, worse, it might suggest weakness, something that folks might want to avoid as dangerous. Let me ask you right now, do you ever think how lovely it would be just to go back once again to a simpler, more innocent time? Like maybe a year ago. Well, while longing for the past probably isn't all that useful, there is one way of looking back that is helpful. The one place where we can see innocence in a way that every one of us can agree on is in the life of a newborn baby. Really, think about it. Is there anything more innocent than a newborn? Take a moment right now and just picture that newborn infant and its surroundings. It's a sweet picture, isn't it? I'm thinking right now of three main features that I see in that scene, in that sweet scene. First, there's mother love. That's the unconditional love that every infant deserves. Does a baby need to do anything to earn that love? No, of course not. It just comes naturally. The second thing that comes to thought for me is absolute dependency. The baby can't do anything on its own. It completely relies on others. And the third feature is, a genuine expectation or anticipation of good. I read once that a newborn still feels so connected, so at one with its mother, that at least at the very outset, it has no fear that all its needs will not be naturally provided. So for the moment, maybe we all can agree that a life that's innocent like a newborn's includes these three things. One, an environment of unconditional love. Two, complete dependency. And three, undoubting expectation of good. Well, what do you suppose happens to these aspects of child innocence? It's not surprising that as a child gradually matures, reliance or dependence on others starts to diminish. Disappointments may begin to reduce any expectation of always getting everything we need. And any feeling of unconditional love can seem gradually replaced with a love that at least feels conditional or earned. And, honestly, these developments may seem like a good thing. Don't we want children to learn to be competent and self-reliant? Don't we want a child to learn to deal well with disappointments? And don't we want children to learn to respect relationships and to gain the affection and closeness of others? Well, of course. But from the viewpoint of God's nature, as Jesus explained it and lived it, there's a way that even as our lives develop in a way we might consider normal, it can be without losing what I'm going to call real innocence. Actually, I'm hoping that we can maybe begin to redefine, maybe rehabilitate the word innocence by raising our sense of it to something more permanent and powerful. Innocence, properly viewed as God-given, that goes way beyond the short-lived, fragile innocence of infancy. Instead, this innocence, well, it sticks around and it actually improves lives, as I feel it did in my own case. Jesus lived this powerful innocence. In the Bible, it's recorded that he healed the sick and radically transformed people's lives. Even those who question this healing record usually have to admit one thing. They have to admit that this individual had a remarkably significant impact on what? On the next 20 centuries of human experience. The Bible also says that throughout his life on earth, Jesus was innocent. So if we're going to look to Jesus as if you will, a model of innocence that accomplishes powerful things, let's consider a few things he said. And I happen to have in mind 3 of his sayings. They're from the Bible, but I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to paraphrase them. They might sound familiar to you. He said, the first one he said that I have in mind is he said, "The Father loves the Son and shows him everything he's doing." He also said, "I can't do anything on my own but what God does." And finally, he said, "It's God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." Do these sayings remind us of anything? Wouldn't you say they dovetail nicely with those 3 features of newborn innocence we were just talking about? For example, if you think of unconditional love, Jesus knew God's unlimited love for him and for us all. I think that's why he said, God loves us, and then shows us everything he's doing. As to dependency, Jesus openly said he was wholly dependent on God for his very life. And as to expectation, Jesus knew God would meet his, indeed all people's needs, that he would give them the kingdom. But what we don't see in the life of Jesus is naivete or ineffectiveness. And that's worth thinking about, because these are the negative characteristics we might sometimes attribute to innocence, at least in adults. But in Jesus' case, the unconditional love, the complete dependency, and the confident expectation of abundant good related to his, well, really our heavenly parent, God. And these elements of innocence were key to the divine power that made Jesus' earthly experience so remarkable. These elements enabled the influence of his career to outlast and transform empires. And you know, these same elements of innocence live within each of us now. What does that mean? It means right now we're directly connected to God's unconditional love and approval. You know, we really don't have to earn our value in the world. It's always ours. It's always been ours. It means it's safe to depend on God to guide our steps and protect us from harm as promised in the Bible. And it means that God provides our needs regardless of how much money we have in the bank or what's going on with the economy. Well, now let's think a little bit together about how we can each discover, or if you will, uncover the innocence we've already got, that same powerful innocence that Jesus lived, that innocence where Christ's power shows us all who we really are. You know, this power of Christ extended way beyond the earthly life of Jesus. It blessed lives before him, like with Moses and Abraham, and it continues to bring healing today. I'd say you could look at Christ as the divine authority God gave Jesus to heal the sick and to take away the world's sins. And this same Christ is God's message today, confirming that earlier Genesis view that even now, regardless of appearances to the contrary, we're actually made in God's image to be, well, like God, healthy, innocent, safe. You know, I saw something of this years ago with an experience with my then little daughter. She was about 4 or 5 years old at the time, and it had become obvious to her mother and me that she had a mild hearing impairment. About that time, I had learned more about prayer as it's explained in Christian Science. And I prayed to see better for myself at first that God gives each of us only what is good and lasting, including hearing. I prayed to see my little girl's innocence, her dependence on God, and God's unconditional love for her and for us all. I began to see how it is that God holds all his children free of any impairment. You know, I was beginning to expect healing because I was starting to see the connection between understanding God's care for us, as explained by Jesus, and the freeing effect this understanding has right now in our daily lives. Sticking to this truth about my little girl's innocence, I realized her God-given capacity to hear, as made in God's image, had never become impaired and had always remained acute. It was a warm spring morning, and she and I were sitting out in the backyard. And incidentally, for those of you in Boston, this was just miles south of Boston in the little town of Norwell. Suddenly she called out, "Daddy, did you hear that birdie?" Sure enough, there was a bird chirping way off in the forest that backed up to our yard. She wouldn't have heard that distant chirping before. I answered, "Yes, sweetheart, I heard it." And that was the end of the hearing problem. Those ideas that led to her healing, you know, they came right out of the Bible. In the Bible, it's recorded that Jesus said this. He said, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." And then referring to this statement of Jesus, Mary Baker Eddy wrote in Science and Health that we can unite with what Jesus established only as we are newborn of spirit. Well, I wonder, how many of us think the things of God or spirit are, well, remote, theoretical, ephemeral, maybe a bit ghostly? Well, what Mary Baker Eddy felt Jesus' life proved was that the things of spirit and God are actually, spirit or God, are actually tangible and immediately effective right here, right now. She said this view healed her. You know, she had spent much of the first half of her life in 19th century New England, chronically ill. And at one point, she suffered a potentially fatal injury. But she discovered what we're talking about now, that God made everything that was really made to be permanently good and healthy, and that a clearer view of how God makes us has a healing impact. And she was healed of those chronic illnesses and of that injury. Now, let me say that again. A clearer view of how God actually makes us. And I admit this is something quite different from our usual mortal view of ourselves, brings healing. She found out that Jesus' healing abilities were the natural result of God's active love, a love that still operates right now in all our lives. It wasn't just a temporary thing that Jesus and a few lucky followers enjoyed. She had long studied the Bible, especially Jesus' life, in her own search for health and healing. She had also looked into various forms of medical and so-called mind remedies. Eventually, she saw a correlation between a person's thinking and health. And actually, medical practitioners today acknowledge that very same correlation, at least to a limited extent. But in her case, there was this great leap forward in understanding. And that leap was this, that bodily organic flesh is actually the least influential thing in health outcomes. Indeed, she came to see that thought alone governs the body, including all health, and that inspired, godly thoughts, that is, perspectives and views uplifted by God, produce good health outcomes. How did she get to this view that, well, still so contradicts conventional wisdom? Well, you remember how Jesus said that because of his love for us, God is always showing us what he's doing for us. Well, she learned what God is always showing us, that God creates us in God's own image, not some other way around where God might seem to be patterned after mortal man. From this, she concluded we're not really mortal or fleshly at all. What do we suppose the word mortal means? Well, there's a slightly stark thought. It means headed for death. Mortality says we're inherently flawed. It says we're vulnerable to crime or disease. And it says we're, well, headed in a bad direction. But as Mrs. Eddy's understanding grew that life is actually in and of spirit or God, and not fleshly or mortal, the notion of flesh and physical nature as, if you will, the framework of life began to impress her less and less. Now, I'm not saying fleshly problems and viewpoints disappear for anyone in an instant, but here's what does happen. This Christly viewpoint tends to put fleshly appearances into perspective, leaving them with less power to alarm us or to harm us. Why? Because we begin to see that physical observations and appearances are not necessarily the final reality we tend to think they are. Mary Baker Eddy healed many individuals, proving what more Christly views can accomplish. What's more, she showed through her book, Science and Health, how any of us can prove this for ourselves. And you know, that's actually been going on for about 150 years now. Science and Health has 100 pages dedicated at the end of the book to testimonies of significant physical healings that people experienced as they simply read the book. Here's her explanation of how Jesus healed the sick. And I'm going to just read this directly from Science and Health. It's just 2 sentences, and I'll just read them now. She wrote, Jesus beheld in science the perfect man who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. In this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness, and this correct view of man healed the sick. This correct view, this more Christly view, you know, it not only heals the sick, but it also shows how powerful this inborn, innate innocence is. You know, at its root, the word innocence means the absence of any harmful or noxious element. This suggests that through uplifted, more Christly views, you know, we each can begin to see freedom from the things we fear. You know, God doesn't leave us defenseless. It's God's purpose. Actually, it's in God's own self-interest to defend each of us. Why? Well, because as I said before, we're really God's own self-image. So while folks are hoping for a therapy or waiting for a vaccine, this Christly innocence is already at work right now, inoculating all of us, inoculating us with God's unconditional love, a love that never fades away, a love that never needs a booster, inoculating us with confident dependence on God's care, inoculating us with safety right inside the safety of God's kingdom. That is an immunity we don't have to wait for. And you know, even more than that, true innocence declares universally that contrary to popular theology and psychology, we're really not miserable sinners after all. Past sins need not haunt us. Why? Because we can dare to know that, well, wrongs that may actually have been part of our own past never really penetrated or attached themselves to who we really are. This says personal history doesn't have the last word. We are right now, and always have been, from the Christly point of view, innocent of all harm, innocent of ever having caused it, innocent of ever being its victim. Why? Well, because Christ is still here, right here, showing us we've never become separated from God, showing us that the real us has always been dependent, reliably dependent on God, showing us that we're safely sheltered within God's love. Mary Baker Eddy lived this same unconditional love, confident dependence on God, and undoubting expectation of God's provision. These qualities of transforming innocence empowered her in what was then a man's world, where, as you know, women had few rights and were generally told they couldn't do the majority of things that she accomplished in the last 40 plus years of her life. Like, well, she made groundbreaking discoveries in theology. I'd say she made groundbreaking discoveries in medicine. She wrote and published extensively. She preached publicly, and she established a worldwide church movement. These are the ways she shared with the world this simple, new, yet actually old view of who we all really are as made only in God's image. And you know, this Christly view, it not only empowers and saves us, but it can also, if you will, correct the wrongs that others do. And this shows how, well, innocence, rather than being passive or submissive to hatred or injustice or crime, is actually an effective counterforce to support peace and justice. A couple of years ago, there was an article about a well-known man who was transformed from hateful, racist ways to more generous and gracious behavior. It may surprise you, but that man was former Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who at one time famously promised racial segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Later, he was wounded in an assassination attempt while he was campaigning for the American presidency. If you remember those details, you might also remember Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. She was actually the first Black woman ever to campaign for the presidency, and she was competing against George Wallace in that same campaign. When she learned of the shooting, she suspended her campaign in order to visit him in the hospital. She sensed she might be able to help him regain or reclaim his humanity. And she told one of her aides, "One act of kindness may make all the difference in the world." Wallace's daughter, Peggy Wallace Kennedy, recently recounted how Chisholm's visit to the hospital did exactly that. She said, "It planted a seed of new beginnings in my father's heart." Over time, that seed bore fruit as Wallace publicly renounced racism, openly sought the Black community's forgiveness, and appointed numerous Black individuals to state government positions in his last term in office. You know, we can't know what all Congresswoman Chisholm was thinking when she visited him. Who can say whether she saw that early Genesis view that man is made only in God's image? But something changed the man. Perhaps she saw or felt that Wallace's outward behavior and personal history were not the whole story of the man. There was something more to him that proved receptive to regeneration of the spirit. And you know, there are other examples of the spiritual regeneration of victimizers. The Bible tells us of Saul, later known as Paul, who at first persecuted the followers of Jesus, but who, according to the Bible, was transformed by Christ to become one of the greatest proponents of Jesus' teachings. Remember John Newton, the profane slave trader who eventually wrote Amazing Grace. He worked with William Wilberforce to help bring about an end to African slavery in England. All this points to what Christ does as the light of God's transforming love shines through individual lives. The elements of innocence that were at the heart of the life of Jesus, they're always to be found somewhere in the mix in these other lives. Let me ask, what do you suppose it is that keeps you and me from seeing our own innocence or the innocence of others? Mrs. Eddy uses the term mortal mind to explain how bad things happen. In the Bible, Paul used a similar term, the carnal mind. Both these terms hint at the mental origin of evil. Bad things tempt us. Tempt us as what? As undeniable reality. This assertion of undeniable evil masquerades as our own thinking. I'm going to say that again. This assertion of undeniable evil, it masquerades as our thinking so successfully that sometimes we think its thinking really is our own thinking. We may even defend it as our own thinking. And then, disguised within the familiarity of our own inner voice, it'll get us to say things like, I'm no good. Or, I'm a victim. Or, what if I become sick? Well, do these things really come to us so much as words? No, they don't. They usually come disguised as discouragement or fear. The fact is, though, these presentations, kind of like fictional stage plays we feel forced to sit in the theater and watch or maybe even take part in, are not the truth about anyone. They are lies about us, lies about what life really is. To counter these lies, the most important thing is to see that in the whole universe, there is only one infinitely good God. And in that exact same place where God is, there is only God's perfect creation, including you and me, still made only in God's image. The word mind with a capital M is another name for God. This mind or God, it harmonizes everything that's really going on, because this mind being God, it's all powerful, and it's also present everywhere. This leaves no room for another mind. And it means a supposed mortal or carnal mind that is a masquerading mentality that's headed for death is tricking us to believe that we or others aren't really made in God's image. By the way, this emphasis on the deceptive mental origin of bad things doesn't necessarily mean that lurking somewhere inside us, there must be some evil that we've got to ferret out. While each of us probably has some room for improvement, the same Christ that shows us we are God's offspring is actually better able than we are to find and erase hidden evil. Our best course is humbly to side with the Bible-based view that God made us to be like him and to stick with that view. This way we can let God's Christ sort out the rest of it. This means the godly removing of evil isn't a matter of human will. You can't force it with brain power. It only happens through humbly finding ourselves made in God's own image. And that brings us back again to prayer, the prayer that shows us who we really are, and just as importantly, who others really are. Prayer may seem like asking God to bless us somehow, and opening up expectantly to God can be a very helpful first step. But if this turns into a feeling of bargaining or negotiating with a man-like, changeable God, that's really not much help at all. The prayer that works is really anything, song, sermon, quiet thought, that helps us see and feel how infinitely loving, immediately present, and powerful God really is, and then to see how we and all others are made in that God's image. It's a matter of tuning into God's universal message that He's holding every woman, every man, every child innocent, safe, immune right now. This kind of prayer is something we're each able to do. We can learn from the Bible and from the explanations in the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health, more about God, more about who we really are as God's son or daughter, and more about how prayer works. If we're going to pray, let's try to feel our own innate, natural innocence in light of God's love. But while we're doing this, let's also remember what this means for the rest of God's sons and daughters. Those other folks out there we're sometimes not so sure about, like maybe politicians or the police or protesters or racists, even criminals. Well, what it means is this, that all of God's sons and daughters are, like God, innocent and good. We're all in this together. And that means in the long run, it's really not enough just to claim our own innocence. We need to pray to see the God-given innocence of everyone, and to pray no longer to be fooled, letting ourselves be fooled about them. Regardless of how others present themselves, the fact is they're still each made in God's own purely good image. I hope no one's out there thinking, what planet is this guy living on? I surely don't want to sound like my head's way up in the clouds. I realize it's not necessarily easy to do this sometimes. Sometimes another's blameworthiness can seem overwhelmingly true. Or, if you will, sometimes almost too delicious to let go of. Do you remember at the beginning of this talk when I said I learned that I could love anyone? That doesn't mean I always succeeded at that afterwards. In a career of dealing with conflict, it was occasionally too easy to see opponents as just offensive mortal persons. But more and more, I began to look beyond that presentation, to see the underlying fact that each of us is truly made in God's wholly good image. This always produced a blessing. This approach is doable. In the humility of prayer, we each can try to see what God is always showing us about universal innocence, and we can let that Christly view begin to heal us, even heal us of the other person's fault. We're each capable of this Christly seeing, and it does bring healing. Well, I'm going to close now with this brief thought. Innocence is the central fact of how God empowers and immunizes us. Jesus lived this powerful innocence, and he showed us we can do the same. The Christian science that explains this and how any one of us can prove it is here to use right now.